In the beginning, God breathed into the dust of the earth and formed man. From the soil of Eden, Adam emerged, not merely a figure of clay, but a living soul, formed in the image of the divine. The breath of God made him live, and that breath echoed through his bones, through the wombs of generations, through the promises yet to unfold. But as Adam stood in paradise, he did not yet know death. Not yet did he understand decay, nor ash. It was not until the fall, when sin entered and the gates of Eden were shut, that the cycle of dust to dust began. For dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. The Lord spoke to Adam, and the shadow of mortality fell upon the children of men. Centuries passed. The bones of prophets, kings, and shepherds lay buried under sand and stone. Yet now, in the age of iron and ash, a question burns in the hearts of many. What of those whose bodies were reduced to ash, cremated, scattered by wind or sea? Will they rise again? In the village of Kedum, nestled near the banks of the Jordan, this very question troubled a young woman named Miriam. Her father, Eliab, a humble scribe, had died in the great fire that consumed their home. His body was never buried, only ashes remained. As the months passed, Miriam found little comfort in the traditions of mourning. She asked the priests, but their answers were vague. She opened the scrolls, but her heart remained uneasy. One evening, as the stars pierced the dark canopy above, Miriam sat beside the embers of her own hearth, watching flame consume what as it had consumed her father's form. A stranger came to her home, an old traveler with silver hair and eyes that seemed to carry the reflection of eternity. He had heard of her sorrow and came not with answers, but with the word. "You fear," he said, "that the fire has undone what God has made." Miriam nodded. "How can my father rise, if there is no body left to rise?" The traveler opened the scroll of Job and read, "Yet in my flesh shall I see God, whom I shall see for myself, and mine eyes shall behold, and not another." Job 19 verses 26 to 27. But how? Miriam asked. Flesh can be consumed. Bones can be ground to nothing. Can the breath return to ashes? He smiled gently. "Let me tell you a story, not mine, but the Lord's." He turned the scroll again to Ezekiel 37, the valley of dry bones. There, the prophet saw a plain filled with bones, bleached and scattered. God commanded him to prophesy, and as he did, bone came to bone, sinew to sinew, and breath entered them. Behold, they lived. "But those were bones," Miriam whispered, "not ashes." The man replied, "And is not he who formed Adam from dust able to gather ash? Is fire greater than the word that made the stars?" Miriam sat in silence. Then he turned to 1 Corinthians 15. "So is the resurrection of the dead. It is sown in corruption. It is raised in incorruption. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. The body that is sown," the traveler explained, "is not the same as the body that rises. The seed dies, yet brings forth the tree. Your father's ash, like a seed, awaits the voice of the trumpet." Miriam's eyes welled with tears, not of sorrow, but of hope. And the traveler spoke once more. "Do not let the fire speak louder than the promise." As dawn broke over Kedum, Miriam stepped outside. The sun rose like a great flame in the sky, yet the land stirred with life. In that moment, she no longer feared the ashes, for she knew that the Creator who gathered dust could summon ashes too. Miriam rose early the next morning. The sun had not yet breached the horizon, but the sky bore the hue of coming light. She knelt by the ashes where her father's memory lived, no longer overwhelmed with despair, but filled with a stirring hope, a hope newly born yet fragile. Still, questions remained. At the synagogue that Sabbath, she approached Rabbi Nathanael, a wise man known for his deep knowledge of the Torah and the writings of the prophets. Miriam bowed respectfully. "Rabbi," she began, "if one's body is cremated, burned completely, can they still rise in the resurrection?" The old rabbi studied her with gentle eyes. "Why do you ask this, child?" "My father," she said quietly. "There was no burial. Only smoke, only ash." Rabbi Nathanael nodded solemnly. "Many today fear that the destruction of the body is the destruction of the soul's hope. But that is not so." He gestured for her to sit, and slowly unrolled the scroll of Psalms. His finger traced the ancient lines. "As a father has compassion on his children, So the Lord has compassion on those who fear him, for he knows our frame. He remembers that we are dust. Psalm 103 verses 13 to 14. The rabbi looked up. God does not forget what he has made. Whether bone or ash, dust or shadow, he remembers it all, and he can remake it better than before. But, Miriam hesitated, is it not the body that will rise? And if there is no body left? The rabbi smiled. You assume that resurrection is simply restoration, that God will rebuild what once was, exactly as it was. But listen to the prophet Isaiah. He opened another scroll. He will swallow up death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces. Isaiah 25 verse 8. Behold, I create new heavens and a new earth. They shall not labor in vain, or bear children for calamity. Isaiah 65 verses 17 to 23. Rabbi Nathanael leaned closer. The resurrection is not a repair, it is a transformation. Not merely a rising, but a recreation. The ashes of your father are no barrier to God. They are as dust in his hand, and he has breathed into dust before. Miriam thought of Adam again, how God had taken dry earth and shaped it into life. If God had made man from dust once, could he not do so again, even from the smallest ash? Then the rabbi said something unexpected. Even those who were devoured by beasts, whom the sea swallowed, whom swords scattered, do you think they are beyond his reach? No, for the Almighty is not bound by what binds man. He stood and pointed to the heavens. See the stars? Each one he knows by name. And if he can name them, who burn with fire and vanish. Surely he remembers your father's frame. Tears welled in Miriam's eyes. So, God keeps the record? He does not merely keep a record, the rabbi whispered. He keeps the essence, the soul, the identity, that which made Eliab your father, that which laughed, wept, believed, none of that was destroyed by flame. And at the trumpet's call, it shall be clothed again, not in mortal flesh alone, but in immortality. He quoted Daniel 12 verse 2. And many who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life. Miriam pressed her hand against her heart. The fear that had haunted her since the fire began to melt away. Later that night, she stood alone under the stars and whispered aloud, ashes are not the end. God remembers ash. And far away, in the realm beyond sight and death, a soul waited, not in torment, but in peace. For the God of dust is also the Lord of fire, and he forgets nothing that belongs to him. Days passed in Kedom, and though the grief in Miriam's heart remained, it no longer weighed her down like stone. She had begun to find comfort in the words of Scripture, in the wisdom of the rabbi, and in the visit of the mysterious traveler. Yet still, a deeper question stirred within her. If the soul returns to God, what becomes of the body? She found herself at the outskirts of the village, speaking with an elder potter named Amos, whose wrinkled hands shaped clay, with the patience of one who had watched generations rise and fall. His shop was simple, but his words often carried the weight of eternity. Master Amos, Miriam asked, watching him mold a lump of clay on the wheel. When you break a pot, can it be made again? The potter chuckled. If the pieces are whole, perhaps, but if it is crushed to dust, I begin anew. Is it still the same pot? No, he replied, wiping sweat from his brow. But it is of the same substance, shaped by the same hands. What was broken is made new, but by the same breath of the artist. Miriam's eyes widened. Like us? Yes, said Amos. The Lord formed man from the dust, not from the air. He shaped the earth and breathed into it. What matters is not the form we return to the earth in, whether whole, burned, broken, or buried, but that the one who shaped us still holds the breath. That night, Miriam opened the scroll of Genesis again. She read, Then the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Genesis 2 verse 7. She underlined the words breathed into his nostrils. It wasn't the body alone that made Adam live, it was the breath of God. Suddenly, she understood. Resurrection was not just about assembling flesh and bone. It was about restoration of the breath, God's life-giving spirit returning to what was once lifeless. But doubt tried to creep back in. She thought of the fire that took her father's body, of the smoke that rose into the sky. Would God gather that smoke, that ash, that dust carried by the wind? The following day, she sought the rabbi again. Rabbi, she asked, will God remember even the scattered ash? Rabbi Nathanael nodded. Do you know what David said? He opened to Psalm 139. If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me. Psalm 139 verses 8 to 10. Nothing, the rabbi said firmly, is beyond God's reach. The sea does not hide. Fire does not erase. God's knowledge of us is not tied to the body alone, but to the soul he made in his image. He continued, quoting from the New Testament writings that had begun to spread from Jerusalem. The first man was of the earth, earthy. The second man is the Lord from heaven. And as we have borne the image of the earthly, we shall also bear the image of the heavenly. 1 Corinthians 15 verses 47 to 49. Eliab, he said, was a man of earth, and now he shall be raised in the image of heaven. That is the promise. Miriam whispered, even if there is nothing left but memory? The rabbi smiled. What man forgets, God remembers. And what is sown in weakness, he will raise in glory. That night, Miriam dreamed of a great field, of ashes and bones and seeds buried in soil. And she heard a voice, strong as thunder and soft as rain, saying, Live. And the field began to rise. The dream lingered in Miriam's heart like a whisper that would not fade. In it, the field of ashes had blossomed into a garden. And where once there were bones and sorrow, now there was life, abundant and radiant. Yet she had not seen the one who called them to rise, who speaks at the resurrection, who commands the dead to live again. It was these questions that led her, weeks later, to journey to Jerusalem. She had heard of a gathering of believers who followed the teachings of a man called Yeshua of Nazareth. Some said he had risen from the dead himself. Others claimed he was the Messiah, the Son of God. Miriam wasn't sure what she believed, but her soul burned with the desire to understand the resurrection, not as myth or metaphor, but as truth. In a shaded courtyard near the pool of Bethesda, she met an old man with eyes that held the weight of many sorrows and the fire of unshakable faith. His name was Simeon, and he had been one of those who walked with the apostles. He welcomed her kindly. You come with a heavy question, daughter. I want to know, she said, voice trembling, if those who were burned, those whose bodies are no more, can rise again. I want to believe, but I need to understand how. Simeon nodded and opened the scrolls, but not just those of the law or the prophets. He brought forth the letters of Paul, the apostle to the nations. His finger rested on a passage from his first letter to the Corinthians. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. 1 Corinthians 15 verses 51 to 52. Miriam leaned in, heart pounding. The trumpet, Simeon said, is not a sound of alarm, but a summons. It is the voice of the Lord calling his people, whether buried in tombs or scattered in seas, hidden in caves or reduced to ash, to rise and come forth. But how can ashes be raised? She asked again. Because the one who made all things speaks, and creation responds, he said. Do you remember what the Master said at the tomb of Lazarus? She nodded. He cried, Lazarus, come forth. And the dead man walked, Simeon said with a soft smile. Lazarus had decayed, yet he rose. What then of those whose bodies were lost to fire? The voice that summoned Lazarus is not weakened by ash. The trumpet does not ask for a perfect corpse. It calls for the soul whom God has known. He opened the gospel scroll and read, Do not marvel at this, for the hour is coming in which all who are in the graves will hear his voice and come forth. John 5 verses 28 to 29. Note, he added, it says all, not some, not only those with bodies intact, not only the buried. All who are in the graves, whether in dust, in fire, in sea, or in memory, shall hear him. Miriam's eyes welled with tears. So the ashes will hear. They will, Simeon said, because resurrection is not dependent on what man preserves. It is rooted in what God has already spoken. And when that trumpet sounds, what was scattered shall be gathered. What was lost shall be found. What was dead shall live. They sat in silence, the wind stirring the olive branches nearby. The breeze felt like the breath of God passing over her once more. That night, Miriam knelt in the Garden of Gethsemane, where the Messiah had once prayed, and she whispered into the earth, "Papa, I will see you again, not as ashes, but as glory." The spring rains had begun to fall in Jerusalem, and with them came the scent of earth being awakened. Miriam remained in the holy city, drawn to the scriptures and the stories of resurrection that stirred from every corner of its ancient stones. But one morning, as she walked past the gates of the city, she met a group of Gentile believers, travelers from Greece, Egypt, and distant Syria, who had come seeking the same truth. They spoke of the resurrection, but one man, a scholar named Julian from Antioch, raised a challenge. "But surely," he said, "some are too far gone. If a man is cast into the sea, if his ashes are scattered across continents, how can his body be restored?" The others nodded. It was a hard thought. Cremation, destruction, oblivion. Miriam stood among them and asked, "Have you read the words of the Master in Matthew?" Julian raised a brow. "What do you mean?" She opened the scrolls and read aloud. "And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other." Matthew 24, verse 31. She turned to them and asked, "What are the four winds, if not the corners of the earth? North, south, east, and west. Even the winds that carry ash are not beyond his command. The angels do not search for graves, they gather souls. And nothing that belongs to God can be lost in the wind." Julian considered her words. "But can something that was destroyed be made whole again?" Another traveler, Lydia of Alexandria, spoke up. "What about the dry bones in Ezekiel's vision? They were scattered across a valley. No flesh, no blood, just remnants. Yet the Spirit of God brought them together." She quoted, "Come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live." Ezekiel 37, verse 9. Miriam smiled. The four winds again. See, even then, the breath of life came from every direction to raise the dead. Another man, older and quiet, finally spoke. "If God can remember the stars by name, why not every cell, every breath, every ash?" They sat together in awe. Later, Miriam returned to her room and reflected. She thought of every person lost in war, in plague, in fire, those buried in forgotten fields or cast into rivers, whose bodies had long since vanished. And yet, the promise remained. "And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead which were in them." Revelation 20, verse 13. There would come a day when the sea would release its hold, when the fire would surrender its ashes, when every molecule scattered by time would be called home. The elements may forget, but God does not. That night, she had another dream. This time she stood on a mountaintop, and a wind blew fiercely from every direction, north, south, east, and west. But it was not a destructive wind. It was a gathering wind. And as it blew, forms began to take shape. Ashes danced through the air like stardust, converging, coalescing, becoming whole again, not as they were, but transformed, radiant, immortal. Then a voice thundered from the heavens. "I have summoned you from the ends of the earth. You are mine." Miriam awoke with tears streaming down her cheeks, not of fear, but of joy. Her heart echoed with truth. Nothing is too lost to be found by God, not even the cremated. Miriam's understanding had deepened. The wind, the breath, the trumpet, each pointed to the truth that God is not limited by what limits man. Yet there remained one final piece of the mystery. She longed to grasp. Had anyone truly risen before? And if so, what does it mean for those who await the resurrection? She returned to the fellowship of believers in Jerusalem, where she met an elderly disciple named Joanna, who had followed Jesus since the days of his ministry. Joanna had been at the tomb. She had seen it empty. She had seen him alive. "Tell me," Miriam pleaded, "about the day he rose." Joanna took her hand, her voice trembling with memory. "It was early, just before sunrise. We went to the tomb expecting death, but the stone had been rolled away, and the grave clothes were folded. An angel stood by and said, 'He is not here, for he is risen.'" She paused, her eyes misting. "And later that day, I saw him. Not a vision, not a spirit. Yeshua, the very one who had been crucified. He spoke to me. He called me by name." Miriam's breath caught. He was flesh, Yes, but not as before. Glorified. Wounds still visible, yet healed. Not bound by death, nor by walls or distance. He ate with us. He taught us. And then he ascended. Joanna opened a worn scroll and read. But now Christ is risen from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. 1 Corinthians 15 verses 20 and 22. The first fruits, Joanna said. Not the only, but the first. A promise of many more to come. Miriam sat in silence, the weight of the revelation settling over her. Christ had not only risen, he had become the pattern. Not merely proof that resurrection was possible, but the assurance that it was inevitable for those who belonged to him. But he had a body, Miriam whispered. What of those who have none? Joanna gently turned to Philippians. Who shall change our lowly body, that it may be fashioned like unto his glorious body? Philippians 3 verse 21. The promise, she said, is not that he will rebuild the exact body we lost. It is that he will transform what we were, weak, mortal, perishable, into what he is now, glorious, immortal, incorruptible. Joanna smiled. You see, dear one, the resurrection is not about restoring what fire took or what time decayed. It is about the victory of life over death. It is about Christ, the firstborn from the dead, and those who will follow. That night, Miriam wandered to the tomb outside the city, the one where Jesus had lain. It was empty still, and yet it was the most full place she had ever stood. Full of promise, full of certainty, full of future. She knelt on the ground where death once claimed victory, and she whispered, Because he rose, my Father will rise. Not in ash, not in shadow, but in glory. She lifted her eyes to the stars, and it seemed to her they were not far away. The season changed in Jerusalem, and Miriam's time in the holy city drew to a close. But she was no longer the same woman who had first come, burdened with fear and doubt. Her journey had been one of questions, but now it was one of faith grounded in truth, a truth stronger than fire, deeper than ash, and brighter than any grave. Before she left the city, Miriam made her way to the Mount of Olives, where Yeshua had ascended into heaven. She stood on the hillside as the wind moved through the trees, and her heart was stirred with a longing she couldn't explain, a longing not just for her Father, but for the day when all things would be made new. She remembered the promise, spoken by the angels on that very mount. This same Jesus, who was taken up from you into heaven, shall so come in like manner as ye have seen him go into heaven. Acts 1 verse 11. That return would signal the final trumpet, and with it, the resurrection of the dead. Her thoughts turned to the words of John. In the final revelation, the last chapter of the Scriptures, and I saw a new heaven and a new earth, and I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain. Revelation 21 verses 1 to 4. That was the future. That was the hope. Not merely the resurrection of individuals, but the restoration of all creation. Bodies reunited with souls. Justice made perfect. Joy without end. And in that place, no one would be forgotten. Not the buried. Not the lost. Not the cremated. For the one who sits on the throne had declared, Behold, I make all things new. Revelation 21 verse 5. As Miriam gazed over the valley below, she imagined it filled with light and singing. The graves, both seen and unseen, opening like flower, petals to the voice of their Creator. She imagined her Father among them, not weak or scorched by fire, but radiant, standing among the redeemed. That night, as she walked the road back to Kedem, the stars shimmered above her, not as distant fires, but as reminders. God remembers every spark. And if he knows the stars by name, he surely knows the ashes of his children. When she reached her village, Miriam did something she had not yet been able to do. She gathered the small urn that held the remains of her father and walked with it to a quiet place, beneath a blooming olive tree. There, she spoke not a farewell, but a greeting. I will see you again, she said softly. You will rise, not because your body remains, but because your name is written in the book of life. Because the voice of the Lord is stronger than fire, and his promises do not burn. She left the ashes there, not abandoned, but entrusted. To the earth, yes, but more importantly, to the one who raises the dead. For in the end, Miriam understood the answer to her question. Yes, the cremated shall rise. Not by the power of man, not by the preservation of flesh, but by the will of God, who speaks life where there was death, and calls to being what the world believed was gone. And when the trumpet sounds, and the sky is opened, and the earth gives back its dead, they will rise, even the ashes,